An injury to one is an injury to all, unless you're a non-union worker, in which case that injury was your fault, and by the way, you owe your boss a new forklift. The United States has an incredible history of organized labor, and yet this year the Supreme Court might hammer one of the last nails into the coffin of American unions, which have been losing power for decades. So, who's killing off unions so successfully? And on a related note, how do you sew Nikes? Have you ever wondered, how come kids don't work in coal mines anymore? And why do we only work 40 hours a week? And where did the weekend come from? He's so sultry. They all came from the American labor movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, one made up of immigrants, communists, socialists, anarchists, and other workers who fought unfair bosses and corporations and were repressed for decades until they finally achieved their Marxist agenda of workplace safety regulations. Our labor history is so badass that May 1st, International Workers' Day, which is celebrated in over 100 countries, started in the United States. It commemorated the 1886 Chicago Haymarket Affair, when police and labor unionists were killed during protests to shorten the workday to 8 hours. But because President Grover Cleveland thought we shouldn't commemorate such a violent day, we're the only country that celebrates our own Labor Day in September. So if you think about it, we're like May Day scabs. So how have our union roots held up through world wars, Reaganism, and global free trade? Not well.
Since the 1960s, union membership has declined, and along with it, the middle-class family income has plummeted.
And overall membership is now at a 97-year low.
Just 11.1% of wage and salary workers belonged to a union last year. That's almost half the union membership rate in the 1980s.
Damn, unions are half of what they were in the 80s? The only other thing that was half of what it was in the 80s is the purity of cocaine. I can't feel my face when I'm with you. I'm just kidding, I do not do cocaine, because it's like the least woke drug, even though it makes you very woke. And you'd think that since we're told by this president and other Republicans how much their party cares about working people, we might hear more from them about supporting labor unions. Instead, you hear them professing to support workers with something that sounds similar.
I support right to work.
Well, I think right to work is a good thing.
We signed right to work because it's very clear that it leads to more jobs.
Creating jobs, growing the economy, and keeping pace with the modern world. That's what right to work is all about.
I support right to work. I actually, as president, will sign and advocate for a right to work bill.
Ooh, spoiler alert, Rick, you never make it to the White House. You become a Republican pull string doll on CNN. Sometimes you don't even show up, they just replace you with a wax sculpture, and swear to God, no one can tell the difference. So what do they mean when they say right to work? Well, just like any Republican talking point, it's pretty much the opposite of what it says. Right to work is legislation that has been enacted in 28 states, and what it does is prevent unions from charging compulsory fees, even though all workers, whether they pay dues or not, benefit from union activity. That includes things like collective bargaining for increased wages and employer-provided health care. Right to work laws, however, encourage workers to not pay at all because without paying unions, they'll still get union representation. But for unions, those laws will mean that they'll be starved of the funds they need to actually operate and advocate for workers, leading to fewer benefits and fewer rights overall. Imagine labor unions are like the Beatles. What's good for John and Paul is also good for George and Ringo. George may have written Here Comes the Sun, but all four Beatles got the #1 hit record. But then right-to-work legislation is passed, and all of a sudden a bunch of no-talent hippie hangers-on show up with guitars thinking they could be in the Beatles without paying their dues, leeching off the Beatles' success. One thing leads to another, and George stops sharing his songs with the band, and Paul is like, I want the right to work on my own album. And John's like, then I'll go solo as well. And Ringo is like, whatever happened to a little love for my friends? And boom, the Beatles are busted. Anyway, how have workers felt about these right-to-work laws?
We have the right to have a good wage, and that we have a right to say what happens in our life, and they're trying to take it away from us.
Don't forget all these benefits people have that aren't in a union. The unions brought those benefits to everybody, and they should be thankful for that.
You want to take away my union brotherhood? You!
Wow. That's the first angry white guy protesting in a helmet and screaming about brotherhood that I actually agree with. Union workers resent right-to-work laws because despite what human skid mark on a quilt Mitch McConnell says, right-to-work has ended up weakening unions' power and hurting workers. Unionization in right-to-work states has been on the decline, and while there may be more businesses and jobs moving into those states, wages are lower in right-to-work states. So the wave of right-to-work laws hasn't helped workers or unions, and that doesn't take a rocket scientist to put together.
I've always had a very good relationship with labor, but I also understand it's more expensive. It costs a lot of money, and there is a downside. And it's very interesting because I never thought I'd see it. I've never thought I'd see what's going on in Wisconsin and so many other states right now. It's a tough time for unions.
Wow. You know, finding a semi-cogent truth from Donald Trump is like finding a four-leaf clover growing in your bathtub. Sure, it's rare, but it's definitely not good luck. And in that clip from 2011, Trump implies that having fewer unionized workers is good because it's cheaper for employers, which is exactly the group that politicians who push anti-union laws are looking out for. It's not about a worker's right to choose to unionize, it's about making it easier for employers to hire a workforce that's more desperate and has fewer demands. Listen closely to how they frame it.
If we don't pass right to work, we will lose out on the Volvos who just passed us by and went to South Carolina.
Making America more competitive in the 21st century.
We've watched closely what's gone on in Indiana. They've seen many more companies look at Indiana, citing this as one of the factors, and they could have thousands more jobs in that state because they became a right-to-work state.
They're basically admitting that when faced with a global economy full of cheap labor and corporations looking to cut costs, American workers shouldn't be protected with labor laws. Instead, they should race to the bottom. Right-to-work pushers don't look at an elementary school and think, these kids are the future. They look at them and think, those nimble little fingers look ready to sew handbags. And ironically, some working class, yes, even some union members voted for Trump because they probably thought he was going to be on their side. But this president and his appointment to the Supreme Court, the T-1000 of terminating workers' rights, might mean right-to-work laws could soon go nationwide.
The Supreme Court is taking on a new case with the potential to financially cripple labor unions that represent government workers.
Yeah, government workers, including firefighters, police officers, and teachers. And even though the Supreme Court already ruled 40 years ago that unions could constitutionally collect fees from all employees for things like collective bargaining, they're revisiting the issue. And if Gorsuch votes the way he probably will, it will totally cripple the power of public sector unions and workers in the remaining 22 states that don't have right-to-work laws. And that would be a huge win for not just people who don't believe in unions, but for the billionaire interests that are behind both right-to-work laws and these kinds of court cases. And those do seem like they take a rocket scientist to figure out because there are a ton of corporations, right-wing think tanks, and foundations who are pouring millions into the effort to kill unions. And since there's been a bit of a work speed up here at Newsbroke, my boss says I have to get more information into less time, so brace yourselves because we're going to go through a lot. Right-to-work laws have been pushed by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which you can think of like a group bathhouse where lawmakers are floated legislation written by corporate lobbyists from places like ExxonMobil, Pfizer, State Farm, and yes, even the Cracker Barrel, because you don't want to know about the apple butter lobby. ALEC also receives money from the Koch brothers, the most heartless white male brothers since the albino twins from the Matrix sequels, whose other foundation, Americans for Prosperity, has supported anti-union efforts around the country. There's also the $800 million Bradley Foundation, whose CEO became Scott Walker's campaign manager in Wisconsin, and who Paul Ryan once called his political godfather. The foundation has given $133 million to the State Policy Network, or the SPN, which is an umbrella group of 66 think tanks and 87 other groups that has an annual budget of $80 million, and whose sole focus is to undermine unions. Included in the SPN are the Illinois Policy Institute and the National Right-to-Work Legal Defense Foundation, which have helped challenge union dues in courts by getting right-wing attorneys to find public workers to file suits like the one the Supreme Court will soon decide on. The National Right-to-Work Legal Defense Foundation is funded by Donors Trust and Donors Capital, which are, again, Koch brothers affiliated slush funds that are often referred to as dark money ATMs of the right. The foundation is also funded by the Walton family of Walmart, a company that requires its employees to watch anti-union training videos like this one.
But the reality is, you're not the only one looking to get your foot in the door at Walmart. Now, you might have heard stories on the news, read about it in the paper, or seen it on the internet, but labor unions are really interested in Walmart and have spent millions of dollars specifically focused on us. We don't think that a labor union is necessary here. We usually don't spend a lot of time talking about them.
I mean, we don't talk about much of anything other than these everyday low prices. Oh, guess I missed my lunch break. That's okay, I'll eat next week. If these aforementioned think tanks and foundations can successfully destroy public sector unions, they can do two other things. Undermine public education, which they've been trying to privatize for years, and getting rid of teachers' unions is key in that. And two, cut off funding for Democratic candidates, because billionaires want to be the only ones to tip the scales in Washington. And if all that weren't bad enough, Neil Gorsuch gave a speech last September to the Fund for American Studies, a member group of, yep, the Anti-Union State Policy Network. So he will probably be that tie-breaking vote needed to kill public sector unions. Or he might have a freak accident involving a yacht and a whale and a bolt of lightning, causing him to suddenly switch souls with the giant mammal and enabling him to finally feel empathy for the first time and cast his vote in support of unions. You know, like Freaky Friday, but more like 40-hour workweeky Friday. But all is not lost. Despite unions being at their lowest in decades, 61% of Americans actually approve of them. And unions have been behind recent wins, like for auto workers, flight attendants, and what do you know, workers at the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. But to protect working class Americans, we might have to dig deep into our collective memory and maybe listen to the immigrants and socialists among us and get back to our former badass American selves. You know, back when maybe America was great. Except for all the racism and sexism and xenophobia. We didn't wash a lot. After all, who doesn't love The Weeknd? I can't feel my face when I'm with you. Don't do cocaine. Don't do cocaine. Thanks so much for watching Newsbroke. Once again, I'm Francesca Fiorentini. Follow me on Twitter at FrannyFio, and please share this video with your networks and let them know about the importance of unions and the Supreme Court decision that will be coming up very soon. And hey, show us some solidarity and give us a 5-star review on our Facebook watch page. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe right now. Click that button. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. Take care.